There is a version of Freddie Mercury that exists only in the conversations that were never printed. The interviews that ran in Rolling Stone, in the NME, in every music publication that sought him across 20 years of Queen's career are the public record. The wit, the deflection, the theatrical performance of a person who had decided exactly how much of himself he was going to give to a room with a tape recorder in it. He was good at this. He was very good at this. The wit was real and the deflection was elegant, and the performance of giving an interview, while carefully controlling what the interview actually contained, was something he had developed across 20 years, until it was nearly invisible, until the journalists sitting across from him felt they had received something genuine while receiving only the version Freddie Mercury had decided they should have. But there were exceptions. There were specific journalists in specific rooms at specific moments to whom Freddie Mercury said more than he had decided to say. And in some of those rooms at the end of the conversation, he said something like, "Please don't use all of that," and the journalists who honored that request carried what they had heard, and some of them carried it for the rest of their lives. The documented interviews across his career form a consistent pattern. He discussed the music, the songwriting, the recording, the specifics of what Queen were doing with genuine depth. He was not willing, in most contexts, to discuss his private life in the terms that journalists wanted, his relationships, his sexuality, his health in later years. When these subjects came up, he deflected with a charm that made the refusal feel like a gift. He would say, "I am as gay as a daffodil," darling acknowledgement and deflection simultaneously. He would say, "My private life is private," with such complete finality that the journalist felt the conversation had been completed rather than ended. The skill was not dishonesty. It was the specific privacy of a person who understood that what you give to a room with a recorder is not yours anymore. David Wigg was a journalist at the Daily Express who conducted some of the most substantial interview sessions that Freddie Mercury gave to any single journalist across his career. The Wigg interviews, a series that extended across years, conducted in an atmosphere of established trust rather than of the initial negotiation that characterizes a first encounter, produced material that is different in quality from most of the Freddie Mercury interview record. Not because Wigg extracted things that Freddie Mercury did not want to say. He was always, by Wigg's own account, in complete control of what he was giving, but because the established relationship between the two men created the specific conditions in which a person sometimes says more than they had intended to. The warmth of a known relationship relaxing the specific vigilance that formal interviewing requires. Wigg has spoken about the Freddie Mercury sessions with a quality of careful reverence that suggests an awareness of having been trusted with something that not everyone received. He has quoted Freddie Mercury on some subjects and declined to quote him on others. The declining is the interesting part. The interview record of Freddie Mercury is the record of a person who was extremely good at giving journalists exactly what he wanted them to have and nothing more. And then there are the rooms where something else happened, where the tape recorder was off, or where the conversation went somewhere the formal interview had not gone, and where what was said was different from the material in the published piece. Some journalists received things in those rooms. Some of them kept the things they received. The keeping is a specific form of honor, and the things that were kept are the part of the record that no one can read. Off the record is a specific journalistic convention, material shared in the understanding that it will not be published in a form that identifies the source. Freddie Mercury used it. Not often he preferred to simply not say things rather than to say them off the record, but in specific conditions, on the subjects he found most difficult to articulate in publishable form, he sometimes went further than the record would show. Peter Freestone has described the quality of Freddie Mercury's conversation with people he trusted as qualitatively different from his public persona, more direct, more vulnerable, more willing to sit with difficult things. In those rooms with a journalist who had earned the trust through years of fair treatment, what he said was something closer to the inside of his experience than the published record contains. The subjects that Freddie Mercury approached and then retreated from in formal interviews are largely inferable from the pattern of what he said publicly. He was reluctant to discuss the full nature of his relationships, Jim Hutton, Mary Austin, the people who had meant most to him. He was reluctant to discuss his fear of being alone, of diminishment, of the silence that follows a concert. He was reluctant to discuss what he thought about death in the specific personal sense of someone who knew from 1987 onward that his own death was a dated rather than theoretical event. And he was reluctant to discuss his illness publicly before the statement made the day before he died. All of these subjects had rooms in which they were discussed with specific people. Not all of those rooms had tape recorders. Not all of the tape recorders were running when the subjects came up. The specific position of a journalist who has been told something in confidence by a famous person who carries in their knowledge something that the public record does not contain is a position of considerable moral and emotional complexity. The convention of off the record exists to serve sources, to allow people to speak more freely by removing the immediate consequence of publication. But the journalist who honors it carries, for the rest of their career and their life, the gap between what they know and what they have written. Some journalists who covered Freddie Mercury have spoken about this gap with a quality of care and restraint that suggests the gap is real, and that what falls into it is significant. They write about what was on the record. They decline to write about what was not. And the declining the specific shape of the silence around certain subjects tells its own story. The questions they did not ask in published pieces. The answers that appear in the public record, but that end abruptly before the thing that must have come next. These are the edges of what was kept. The silence in an interview is part of the interview. The thing the journalist did not ask because they already knew the answer from a previous room is the shape of what was kept. The thing Freddie Mercury said and then said, please don't use all of that, is present in the interview, in the same way that a missing paragraph is present on a page. You can see the place where it was, you can feel the weight of what is not there, and the not being there tells you something essential. Journalism is what was printed. History is what was printed plus what was kept. And what was kept about Freddie Mercury is some of the most important part of it. Rick Skye was a British music journalist who interviewed Freddie Mercury multiple times across the 1980s and who wrote one of the first full biographies of Freddie Mercury, published in 1992, shortly after his death. Skye's accounts of his interview sessions with Freddie Mercury have a quality that is different from many contemporaneous accounts. A quality of genuine proximity, of having been in rooms with Freddie Mercury over a period of time in which a certain level of familiarity had developed. In his writing and in his interviews about Freddie Mercury, Skye has referred to conversations that informed his understanding of Freddie Mercury's private experience, without directly quoting them the specific handling of material that exists in the awareness of someone who received more than they published. He has described Freddie Mercury in these accounts as someone who was genuinely aware of his own complexity and who, in the right room at the right moment, was capable of speaking about it with a directness that the public persona almost never showed. These moments, documented in the form of Skye's understanding rather than in the form of direct quotation, are the shadow record. The interviews behind the interviews. The specific contents of what Freddie Mercury said off the record are not known, that is, by definition, the point. But the inferable contents have a shape. He spoke about loneliness, the fear of it, the question of whether the life he had built was enough. He spoke about his illness with a frankness impossible in any published interview. The quality of a person who knows their own timeline and, in a room with someone they trust, no longer has reason to manage it away. He spoke about love, the specific people he had loved, in terms that went beyond the deflection he gave formal questions. He spoke about regret in the way someone speaks about regret when they have enough clarity to see both what they did and what they left undone. These are the inferable contents. They are inference, not fact. But the inference is grounded in what the people who were in those rooms have allowed to be understood. The reason the off-the-record Freddie Mercury matters, the reason the conversations that were never printed are worth discussing even in the absence of their specific contents, is that they are evidence of something that the formal interview record obscures: the person behind the persona. The formal interviews are the performance of Freddie Mercury, giving an interview skilled, entertaining, controlled. The off-the-record conversations are the person who performed the formal interviews, in the room after the performance, when the performance was over. These two things are not simply different versions of the same person. They are the public self and the private self of one of the most public people of his generation, a person who understood, more completely than almost anyone else, the difference between what you give to a room with a recorder and what you give to a room without one. Both rooms are real. Both versions of the person are real. But the version in the room without the recorder is the one that the formal record can only ever approach from the outside. And the journalist who sat in that room carried something that the formal record cannot contain. The formal record is what he decided to give. The off-the-record rooms are what he gave when the decision had already been made, and what remained was simply the person with the specific things that were left. Some journalists sat in those rooms. Some of them are still alive. Some of them still carry what was said. And none of them have broken the word they gave to a man who trusted them with the things he could not say on record. The word was kept. The things are kept with it. That is the kind of trust that lasts. There is a specific kind of Freddie Mercury interview, documented in the accounts of several journalists who conducted them, in which the tape recorder was running and then stopped. Not because of a technical failure, because Freddie Mercury asked for it to stop. And in the silence that followed the stopping of the recorder, something was said. And then the recorder was started again, and the interview continued in the formal register. And what was said in the silence was not in the transcript. And the journalist who stopped the recorder and heard what was said in the silence took it with them. David Wigg has described something like this in general terms: the specific shift in quality that an interview with Freddie Mercury could take when the formality relaxed, when the conversation moved from the performed to the actual. The actual was different from the performed, and the actual was what the tape did not contain. Some of the journalists who interviewed Freddie Mercury are still alive. In contemporary interviews about the historical interviews, there is occasionally the specific quality of something being almost said, a sentence that begins and redirects, a reference to a conversation whose content is not given, a careful formulation that acknowledges something without disclosing it. These moments are not coyness. They are the specific handling of material received in confidence that the journalist, decades later, still feels bound by. The word kept for 40 years. The things said in a room in the 1980s, still in their knowledge, still not on record. The honor is real. The cost, what was said in those rooms, is not in the history, and the history is incomplete by exactly that amount. The history of Freddie Mercury is complete except for what was never printed. And what was never printed is some of the most important part. The journalist who kept the word is still alive. The thing that was said is still not on record. The tape recorder stopped, and in the silence after it stopped, Freddie Mercury said something, and the journalist in the room heard it, and took it with them, and has kept it, for 40 years. That is the shape of what we don't know, the shape of what he gave to someone he trusted, the shape of what trust looks like when it is complete. Freddie Mercury told one journalist everything or something closer to everything than the formal record contains. And then he asked them not to print it, and the journalists kept their word. And the thing that was said in that room, the specific version of Freddie Mercury that existed in the off-the-record conversation, the version that spoke about loneliness and love and fear and regret and the timeline he knew about and managed in private while managing a different story in public, that version is not in any archive. It is not in any published interview. It exists only in the journalist's memory and in the specific form of knowledge that a person carries when they have been trusted with something and have honored the trust. The history of Freddie Mercury is the history of what he was willing to give the world, which was extraordinary, plus the history of what he kept, which we can only approach from the outside. The journalist has the inside. They kept the word. The word is still kept. And the thing it protects is Freddie Mercury's privacy, the last thing of his own that he managed to keep.